Glamour Prestige presents Virtual Learning Party every Tuesday and Thursday starting March 24th, 2020 for students in grades 3 through 6, reading and English only.
Your hosts are Dr. Jacqueline Walker and Velvet Smith, who are ready to turn up for learning. Hey!
All right, today's I can answer passage based questions with 100% accuracy with the help of reading strategies, passages, videos, and activities. Hi guys, today is Thursday, May the 7th, and we didn't get to see you on yesterday. Of course, we saw you on Tuesday, but on Thursdays we do something different now. So on today, we will be doing
passage review, and today our passages will involve Martin Luther King.
Okay, let's take it away.
All right, so now we're going to do our outstanding openings. Remember, this is when we hook you into what we're going to be doing later. So our video today is about Martin Luther King. So sit back and enjoy this Brain Pop video.
Enjoy this movie, then visit brainpop.com for much more. Yep, that's where he gave his biggest speech. Dear Tim and Moby, can you do a Martin Luther King movie? Thanks, Sarah. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the most important leader of the American civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was about having universal rights for all people, regardless of gender, income, or skin color. It's hard to believe, but America in the first half of the 20th century was a very different place. In many parts of the country, black people weren't allowed to eat at the same lunch tables, go to the same schools, or even use the same bathrooms as white people. This practice of separating blacks and whites was called segregation. Well, no, and that's the astonishing thing. It was all legal under the Jim Crow laws, a set of rules governing how blacks and whites were allowed to mix. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in the midst of all that inequality. He was born in 1929 to a middle-class family in Atlanta, Georgia. Both his grandfather and his father were pastors at a local church. King attended religious colleges in Philadelphia and Boston. He was inspired by Northern society's more liberal views of race. Well, black people and white people mixed a little more freely there than in the South. Dr. King returned to the South and moved to Montgomery, Alabama, with his wife Coretta in 1953. He became a pastor and a community leader. When a local woman, Rosa Parks, was arrested for refusing to give her bus seat to a white man, King organized a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Most black citizens of Montgomery refused to ride the buses for over a year. The boycott helped bring about change, and in 1956 a Supreme Court decision banned segregated buses. After that victory, King helped organize a group of churches dedicated to nonviolent protests for civil rights. Dr. King was inspired by the life of Mahatma Gandhi, whose nonviolent leadership helped free India from British rule. Over the next decade, King led protests and marches to support African American rights all over the country. The most famous was the March on Washington in 1963. Over 250,000 people gathered in the nation's capital in support of civil rights. It was there that Reverend Dr. King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
King's gift for eloquent public speaking was a big help to his cause. His protests and marches throughout Alabama turned the world's attention to the issues of civil rights. The rest of the country watched in shock as local police turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protests. I guess you could say that people back then were threatened by change. King was arrested numerous times during these marches, but it paid off. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 overturned segregation laws around the country. In 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. As the recognized leader of the civil rights movement, he went on to fight against poverty and the Vietnam War. Then, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. His killer, James Earl Ray, was captured months later. Even though he was only 39 when he died, King changed the face of this country. Without his influence, who knows how long it would have been before equal rights were granted to everyone. Yeah, you're right. We still struggle with racial equality to this day, but thanks to Dr. King, it's a conversation that everyone's involved in, regardless of the color of their skin.
Visit us at brainpop.com for more on this topic and hundreds of others. You'll find movies, games, quizzes, and activities. For learning at your fingertips, check out our mobile apps.
All right, I hope you were paying attention to that Martin Luther King video from Brain Pop because we have a comprehension question for you. It says, who inspired Dr. Martin Luther King and why? If you need to go back and look at the video, you can do that just to double check your answer. If you have this sheet, go ahead and write it down right there under where it says and why. And if you don't have the sheet, just break out your notebook or a sheet of notebook paper and go ahead and write down that answer. If you need to pause me to think about it, or if you need to go back and look at the video, you can do that as well. All right, we're about to give up the answer.
Okay, and the answer to that question is Mahatma Gandhi because of his nonviolent leadership. So that's who actually influenced Martin Luther King.
Okay, we are about to start off with our reading strategies. If you remember last week, you had reread as a reading strategy. This week, you have another one that Ms. Smith will tell you about.
All right, so our reading strategy is question. Think about monitoring your understanding by asking questions when words, sentences, or ideas do not make sense. Rereading to clarify. So we're going to mix both of our strategies in this week. Rereading from last week and questioning this week.
Okay, if you have this sheet that says Martin Luther King Jr.'s author's purpose, then go ahead and take it out because this is going to be our first little mini passage prep before we get into the full passage. So here we go. Read the passage. Write the author's purpose for writing it below. Either to persuade the reader to inform the reader about, to entertain the reader with the story about, and to explain to the reader how to. When you're also reading this, we want you to remember to use your other strategies that you learn by underlining or circling, using Post-it notes, or using highlighters to help you to get through the passage with some additional resources to help you. So let's go. 250,000 people of all races traveled to Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. They were a part of the March on Washington, one of the most famous protests against discrimination. It was the largest discrimination ever in the nation's capital. Furthermore, it was one of the first demonstrations to receive extensive television coverage. People all over the world were watching the event on television and listening to it over the radio. Several people spoke and performed that day. Most people remember Dr. Martin Luther King's speech best of all. He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Those famous words are still remembered today. So, what is the purpose of the above passage? You can go ahead and pause us, and we need you to choose one of the 4 choices. Is it to persuade the reader to inform the reader about, to entertain the reader with a story about, or to explain the reader how to? So if you need to go back through the passage and reread it, and remember our strategy this week is to question. If you have some questions about what you're reading, some words there that you may not understand, then you question exactly what you think needs to be clarified in your mind. So go ahead and do that. And when you unpause us, the answer will be here waiting for you.
Okay, so let's look at our answers. So the question was, what is the purpose of the above passage? And it is to inform the reader about the March on Washington. And as you see, underlined in yellow, it supports to the author's purpose. So we were informed about the March on Washington, and some examples were that they were part of the March on Washington, one of the most famous protests against discrimination. It was the largest demonstration ever in the nation's capital. Then we also have several people spoke and performed. Most people remember Dr. Martin Luther King's speech best of all. All of that gave us additional information about the March on Washington.
Okay, we're going to review the strategy of questioning or asking questions before we go into our big passage prep for today's lesson. So let's look at this. Ask questions. How do readers ask questions? So if you see there's a graphic there, it has who, what, where, when, and why. So good readers ask questions to themselves before, during, and after reading in order to make sense of what they're reading. So let's look at some bullet points. Asking questions allows for active reading and interacting with the text. It gives readers a purpose for reading. It helps readers to make predictions as they are reading. Asking questions can help readers to clarify any difficult vocabulary words or confusing parts of a text. So here's some examples of questions that you can ask yourself. What do I think will happen next? How is the character changing? What is the author's purpose? Where is the setting? So if you go ahead and ask yourself these questions before, during, and after reading, it will also help with your comprehension of the text. Okay, this will be our passage about famous African Americans, Martin Luther King Jr. So, as you know, we will be highlighting, we will be circling, we will be boxing. And you'll be able to do the same thing as well. You do have a copy of the actual passage, so you can do this if you want to as well. So let's get started. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. There's a national holiday in his honor that is celebrated every January. His famous I Have a Dream speech is still talked about today. He is a hero of civil rights in America. So I would underline, if I was you, one of the most important figures in civil rights. And I guess we would add a movement as well. And then a national holiday in his honor, celebrated every January. And then I Have a Dream, talked about today. And then probably, if you wanted to, probably underline hero of civil rights in America. So if I was you, I would go ahead and get that. If you don't have the sheet to print out, I would just go ahead and write down some of the things that we've underlined.
All right. King was a Baptist minister. He had an incredible ability to speak and be heard. He was expressive and powerful with his words. He gained the support of thousands of blacks and whites. He became famous throughout the world. And then this paragraph, we need to underline, King was a Baptist minister. And then let's put ability to speak and be heard. And he was powerful with his words. He gained support of blacks and whites, and then he became famous throughout the world.
Okay, and in our last paragraph, in 1964, King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his civil rights work. Ironically, his work for peace resulted in violent reactions. On several occasions, people threw rocks at King. Some even went so far as to bomb his family's house in Montgomery, Alabama. But the worst act of violence ended King's life. He was shot and killed at the age of 39. So I want you to underline 1964, King won, Nobel Peace Prize, civil rights work. And then I want you to also underline that peace resulted in violent reactions. And then I want you to go down to the last sentence and say that violence ended King's life and then shot and killed at the age of 39. Okay, so now it is time for us to ask you the questions, and we will go ahead and get started on those. If you have the questions, go ahead and pull those out as well. If not, number your paper 1 through 7, and then write down the answers.
Question number 1. According to the text, when is the national holiday in Martin Luther King Jr.'s honor? Is it A, in the 1950s and 60s, B, every January, C, anniversary of his famous speech, or D, in the year 1964?
Question 2. What does the author describe in the text? A, different important people in the civil rights movement. B, the speaking ability and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. C, U.S. national holidays celebrated every year in January. D, the important figures who influenced Martin Luther King Jr.
Question number 3. Read this paragraph from the text. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. There is a national holiday in his honor that is celebrated every January. His famous I Have a Dream speech is still talked about today. He is the hero of civil rights in America. What conclusion can you draw about celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. based on this evidence? Is it A, Martin Luther King Jr. celebrated every January only because of his famous I Have a Dream speech? B, Martin Luther King Jr. has been celebrated since the 1950s because of his work in the civil rights movement? C, Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated every January for the contributions that he made to the civil rights movement? Or D, Martin Luther King Jr. created a holiday in January in order to continue to remind Americans about the civil rights movement?
Okay, number 4. Based on the text, which of the following is most likely? A, King believed that violence was the answer to civil rights. B, everyone loved Martin Luther King Jr. C, many people would gather to listen to King speak. D, not very many people have heard King's speeches.
Question number 5. What is the main idea of this text? A, many people dislike Martin Luther King Jr. B, Martin Luther King Jr. was important in civil rights. C, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot at the age of 39. Or D, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister.
Number 6. Read these sentences from the text. He had an incredible ability to speak and be heard. He was expressive and powerful with his words. As used in the text, what does the word expressive mean? A, shy and quiet. B, communicating feelings. C, calmly listening. D, causing sadness.
And our last question, question number 7. Choose the answer that best completes the sentence. There were violent reactions to Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. Blank, he talked about peace. Is it A, so, B, even though, C, before, or D, because? So now you have a chance to go over your 7 questions, and we'll be back in a minute with the answers to those questions. Here are the answers to our 7 questions. Question number 1. According to the text, when is the national holiday in Martin Luther King Jr.'s honor? That is B, every January.
Number 2, what does the author describe in the text? B, the speaking ability and influence of Martin Luther King Jr.
Number 3, what conclusion can you draw about celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. based on this evidence? The correct answer is C. Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated every January for the contributions that he made to the civil rights movement.
4. Based on the text, which of the following is most likely? C. Many people would gather to listen to King speak.
Question number 5. What is the main idea of the text? The answer is B. Martin Luther King Jr. was an important in civil rights.
6. Read these sentences from the text. He had an incredible ability to speak and be heard. He was expressive and powerful with his words. As used in the text, what does the word expressive mean? B. Communicating feelings.
And number 7, choose the answer that best completes the sentence. There were valid reactions to Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, so it's B, even though he talked about peace.
Okay, if you need to go back and look at your answer choices, if you need to go back and look at the information in the passage, you have the ability to do both of those because both of them that you have is right there in your packet. If not, you can always go back and rewind the video so you can see the passage all over again.